Alright guys, let's work on your first online lesson here. Now, as you know, we are working on informational text, non-fiction text, and what that means is information that is true, right? You've been doing a couple writings that have been true, and also some readings. And despite this information being true, it is important to realize that there are some situations where there's cases of media bias. So in order to understand what media bias is, we have to take a look at each one of these broken down. So media being news articles, journalists, news reporters, producers, things that you might see in the evening news, the newspaper, mass media, online, that type of stuff. And then bias means to lean a particular way, to believe one thing over another. And so as a definition, let's get as media bias is the way, let's say, journalists and news producers present a particular view. And what this means is they come in to their story with a particular way that they feel about it. And the way that they write their story is slighted towards the way they feel about it, and might sometimes leave out the entire story, or is definitely claiming what they believe is to be the whole truth, and that might not be the entire truth. So there are a few ways that media bias can be evident. The first is by omission. This would be leaving out the opposing view or other sources. This can either happen within the story itself, or if you're thinking about a particular newspaper, it can happen within the paper in terms of a series of stories. Make sure you can see everything here. So in order to support their point, and you've learned about this already, they use information, evidence to back up what they're saying. Well, whatever evidence they're using to back up what they're saying, they're strategically leaving out evidence that would say the opposite. Let's talk about another one. Selection of sources. Selection of sources. This would be when the journalist might say something like, experts believe, sources say, something like that. The experts believe, the sources say, these people are the ones that they have, once again, consciously chosen to support their angle on that story. So they're not going to be the experts of the opposing view. They're not going to be the sources of what does not support the way that they think about it. They're going to be the ones that support the way they think about it. All right, I'm going to slide you over here. For our last one, And our last one has to do with placement. And now thinking about that within a newspaper, where is this story? You know, if it's going to be an important story, or if it's going to be something that the editor or the people that are creating the placement of the articles deem as important, specifically if it's something that they deem is important, it's going to find itself at the front page or early on, or the heading might be a lot bigger. So this is the location of the articles. Within the newspaper, well, let's say within the news of the newspaper. It's important to think about the headlines. Give me a second to write that. So if they believe, let's just say they have a certain political kind of preference, and they're always keeping their viewpoint in the front page at the beginning, and everything else gets kind of downplayed to the second or the third page, well then if they constantly do that, you can kind of see where that bias is coming into play. Similarly, as you read the headlines, and as you read the article, as you can also be able to tell early on, depending on the location specifically of the viewpoints within the articles. Okay, so what I mean by this is whatever information they're leaning towards, whatever bias they have, they're probably going to bring it out early on in the story. And they probably will wait to include some of the information that goes opposed to the bias that they have until later on in the article, or they might omit it entirely. Okay, so the takeaway here, guys, is that just because you read something in the newspaper, just because you're watching the news, doesn't mean it's without bias. You know, a lot of those times, there's particular media bias. They believe something. A lot of times, it's liberal, conservative, how they view about politics and that type of thing. And so it comes with some sort of bias. It's our job to see if we can recognize that bias, and that's what we're going to do in class. So the next step here would be to read different articles and see if we can determine from omission, selection of sources, and placement what the viewpoint of the news editors and the journalists are that did this.